So hello everyone and welcome to 107 Projects and to SAMAG's May event, Arts and Innovation Balancing the Risks. I'm Adrian Burnett and I'm the co-chair of SAMAG, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and we thank them for their custodianship of this land. SAMAG would also like to acknowledge our funding partners, the City of Sydney and Create New South Wales, as well as our venue partners, 107 Projects here in Redfern. So arts and innovation, balancing the risks. I thought I'd just open by sharing a small quote by American writer Walter Isaacson. He writes that the next phase of the digital revolution will bring a true fusion of technology with the creative industries, but the interplay between technology and the creative arts will eventually result in completely new forms of expression and media. So, as you will have read in our promo and our blurb, we've said that evidence abounds about a brain drain here in Australia in the sciences and technology sectors, with ambitious innovation agendas have failed to address. What role can the arts play in spurring new approaches to innovation in wider society? How can artists play a role in designing new practices for design, industry, medicine or social services? And can the arts play a central role in the transformation to knowledge-based innovative economies? That's a lot to get through. Can the arts influence how we see innovation beyond technology? We have a fantastic panel and we have a great and very bespoke group of participants. So thank you for coming along. We've got a few more joining. I'm also joined by a couple of our committee members. So welcome to our new committee members. And I'm just going to introduce our speakers. So the first person is artist Sarah Hubold, who specialises in managing and evaluating projects and programs within the arts and equity and cultural sectors. Sarah is well known for her unique and versatile performance work across circus, physical theatre and dance, as well as her passion for enhancing diversity. She's held various consulting and advisory roles with arts institutions as diverse as University of Technology, Accessible Arts, Art Gallery of New South Wales, Museum of Contemporary Art, Library of New South Wales, and Sarah's also spoken at TEDx on the topic of accessibility. Next, we have Vicky Sowry, whose expertise is in brokering opportunities for artists to research and experiment with science and technology partners in industry and academia for mutual benefit. She's an assessor and industry advisor for the Australia Council and has contributed to sector capability and policy development through governance roles she's held over 25 years. She's been the director of ANAT since 2012. And Andrew Yip is a researcher and new media artist who researches the applications of immersive and embodied new media technologies for the GLAM sector, galleries, libraries and museum sector, I'm hoping.
And archives. That's
and
the
archives.
Yeah.
Thank you. Andrew designs interactive systems for museums and galleries, and his installations have been exhibited at institutions such as the Art Gallery of New South Wales, Hyde Museum of Modern Art, Gallery of South Australia and the Powerhouse Museum. And finally, our moderator for this evening is Peter Patellae. Peter has an MBA in Entrepreneurship, a Bachelor of Business in Accounting and Finance, and was previously an international fashion designer. She's a polymath who is equally passionate about the numbers as well as the look and feel of a product. Peter is currently a relationship manager at the CSIRO's On Innovation program and has 15 years experience in sales, marketing, business development, product design, retail and consulting. So please give them a warm round of applause. And thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Peter and I'll be back after the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. And welcome everyone. Thank you for coming this evening. It's a really nice, intimate group tonight, so I'm really pleased you can all make it on this very cold evening. So without further ado, I'm going to like to start by asking our incredible panellists here tonight just to sort of introduce themselves, describe sort of who they are, what they do, and what innovation means to them. So I'll start with you, Vicky.
We didn't know she was going to do this. What were the questions, sorry?
So just introduce yourself, so who you are,
Okay,
what
so
you
I'm-
do.
Yeah. So I'm Vicky Sari. I run the Australian Network for Art and Technology, and our focus is really on, I guess, trying to communicate the power of having an artist working in non-art spaces. So we've spent a lot of time putting artists in science and research settings and also emerging technology settings, because we feel that it's really important to have artists in this conversation about our future, and that they're really key in helping us understand and in some ways imagine our future. So that's what we do. Is there something else?
And what does innovation mean to you?
Look, that's a very long discussion, and I think that's part of what we're going to tease out here. Part of my concern about, I guess, the word innovation is it means so many different things to different people that it can actually become meaningless. Well, certainly whenever I hear the word now, I kind of do a mental eye roll. So I'd like, I think part of this discussion is about really trying to get a sense of what innovation can mean, I guess, rather than what it can be often seen to mean. So, yeah.
Great. And Sarah?
Hi, my name is Sarah. I worked at UTS for a year, University of Technology Sydney, in the accessibility specialist role. And in that role, I was engaged with the UTS hatchery and other innovation departments, the design department, and the CIC, so really in intelligence in relation to new things that are up and coming that universities love to explore and make and really pave the way in. And teaching students how to also have that design thinking kind of mindset. And every time I'd have a discussion there, it was really obvious and evident to me that in that design thinking framework that people with disability weren't really considered, particularly when the innovation was around making life better for people with disability. So that really stuck in my mind within that role, and it made me really, think about what we can do to stimulate that conversation. Then I spoke at TEDx Sydney around what it means to be a dancer with partial sight, because dance is taught so visually. And so that made me realise that innovation is something that I actually do every day because of the body that I'm in. I find new ways of doing things when there's brick walls in front of me. And in order to do that, I look at what's happened in the past to forge my present and to create a future. So I really believe in that lineage when it comes to knowledge, and not just creating new things for the sake of new things, but really building on what we already have. And then as an artist, I'm a circus performer, and so as an audience member for my own education about what else is happening around that I'm interested in and I want to see, or in terms of art and technology or innovative products and designs, I often find as an audience member or as a user, I'm excluded from those experiences because it's actually not... blindness isn't really considered in the end product. So my message around that is to design, when you're designing, to think about what it means for everyone that might be engaged with the thing that you're trying to make, or the new idea that you might have in your mind. So that's kind of the lens that I look at. But also as an artist, I'm really into creative development processes where you're allowed to fail. So for me, it's just about bringing consciousness to the different bodies that people have. And then the last thing for me is that I was also part of an amazing project with Vicky and Nat called the Unfixed Project in 2015 and onwards. And that was around the provocation that Vicky set around, if we have particular lived experiences and unique ways of living in the world, what exactly is disability? What is disabled? So for me, I believe that our community is also a leader in the innovation conversation.
Thanks, Sarah. And you, Andrew?
I'm not as impressive this. I'm a research fellow at UNSW Art and Design in a kind of a wacky, weird science art lab called iCinema, where my research focuses on looking at how immersive, embodied visualization technologies can help us to understand human culture, history, and to democratize knowledge. But I've had like basically one of every job that my parents ever warned me against in the arts. One of everything that doesn't pay. Writer, curator, artist, all these sorts of things. But to draw on what both Vicky and Sarah have said, like I'm not sure what innovation means. No one is sure. In day-to-day parlance, we think innovation is making something new for the sake of making something new tech. But I think that there is a vital role for artists and cultural practitioners to play in an innovation economy, because without the kind of human factors that Sarah was talking about, innovation means nothing. Like, what is innovation but for us producing a new way of seeing that helps us understand the world and navigate the world and improve our lives? And so one of my bugbears is that, in every kind of innovation economy, people are talking about STEM, as if your ability to solve an algorithm or write an algorithm is going to, by itself, change humanity. And we know that it produces Instagram likes, right? But what artists can bring is the human side to design, what Sarah was talking about, like the human-centric vision for how we can use these potentials in order to benefit us all.
Oh, great. I'd like to also open up a little bit of a discussion with the panel. So on that topic of STEM, what are your perspectives on that? Do you think we could better collaborate the arts and the sciences?
Does everyone know what STEM is?
Yeah.
We're talking about science technology.
Sorry, what was your question?
So the intersection, so how we're currently seeing the arts and sciences collaborating currently, do you think it could be improved? And what's your perspective on that?
What is the perspective of arts and technology and the collaboration between them? That's right.
With science?
Oh, sorry, science.
Okay, well, I'll give them time to think about it. But
Yeah.
So the question was so currently, we brought up the idea of STEM, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Do you think we could see better collaboration between the sciences and the arts currently?
Look, it's a total no-brainer that STEM needs to go to STEAM. Sarah has kind of captured it in one. It's if you don't bring bodies and our lived experience into a STEM experimentation innovation space, we all know the stories about, hand washing systems that don't recognise non-white hands. And so, if you've got black hands, you're not going to get your hands washed. We've got this group of, and I'm going to be very generalising here, but essentially well-educated white men designing products for the rest of us. And so, and they can only look at it through that frame. And so you do have, facial recognition systems being found to be inherently racist. All of that stuff. So unless you bring, and whether it's arts or humanities, but basically any sort of human experience into that STEM model is only going to improve it.
Would you like to add anything, Sarah?
I guess as an artist, it's about thinking outside of the box, and I think we're really good at that. We don't really speak up about our assets well as artists and arts industry. So, we've got massive strengths to bring to the STEM conversation. And I know we all know that in this room, but I'm also a believer in the STEAM.
Yeah, I agree with Vicky. It's a total no-brainer. And in my faculty, the whole faculty is moving from a traditional art school to one that is natively engaged with other disciplines, engineering, built environments, science, and we've done a huge amount of productive things together. And when you combine the two, you generate knowledge in each field. So we've done studies using the particle accelerator of paintings, and what we find when we image these historical objects with a particle accelerator, is that we find new things about chemistry, we find new things about particle science, but we also find new things about the network of connections of human society across that particular time in history. And we find things about how people make things and the reason why they make things and what it means to cultures. And so it's more, it's one of those classic things of it being more than the sum of its parts. That when you add the A into STEM, people think of it as an afterthought, that it's like an indulgence to teach kids humanities at school, but it actually is productive for all fields that you apply it to.
Okay. So just in the interest of time, I'd actually like to, really lucky tonight to have a really nice intimate group, so I would like to open up basically the panel for some questions and answers from the audience. We've got a roaming microphone, so...
Yeah.
Equally, we could wrap it on for 5 minutes, a bit more about what we do.
Yeah. What would you like?
Yeah, Vicky, why don't you give us a little bit
I'll
more
go.
about?
Look,
Yeah.
I said I didn't want to go first, but I will. There's this persistent meme, which is that innovation is applied creativity. But that brings up the idea of intent, and that is one of the most problematic things, I think, around innovation. So I'm going to give a couple of examples. We had a sculptor called Nola Farman, and she went and worked with the Centre for Organic Centre for Organic Chemistry at University of Newcastle, and their shtick was creating, actually I'll read it properly, imagine a planet able to harness the abundant light energy received every second of the day, a city where every building, every vehicle and every surface has an electricity generating coating that makes low-cost energy available to all. So that's what this centre is pursuing. And so they were particularly looking at photovoltaic paints, right? So you paint your house and it's generating electricity. And so we had the sculptor go in there, and our residencies, one of the great things about them, I think, and actually leads to what I would call genuine innovation. I will start by saying that we're operating in an environment where our government has a very, very narrowly defined concept of innovation, and that is taking new products and services to market, and the market is the most important part for them. And they don't seem to understand that these products and services don't just come out of thin air. And in fact, there's this huge, unfunded, managed experimentation process where failure is essential, where, all of these things. And in fact, where you're kind of unshackling the intent from the experimentation. And what Nola got, she kind of got hooked on this which is $1 million question for solar panels, which is how do you make them track the sun throughout the day to optimise their angle to the sun in order to generate the most electricity. And that is the big question in the solar panel market. And so they've tried various things. They've tried solar-powered motors and all of these sorts of things. And she came up with this idea that they'd never, ever thought of before, which was shape memory alloys. And so she went out of the Faculty of Organic Engineering and started talking to a guy in mathematics who was this incredible, he was really good at geometry. And so what they did was they created a test maquette where it was a sculpture, and where they were able to basically use shape memory alloys and geometry. So shape memory alloys, what you do is, if you want to create a spring, you create the spring, you heat mould it. So when heat's applied, it goes into a spring. When there's no heat, it just drops down into a straight piece of metal, and as it heats up, it comes into a spring. And so her and this mathematician figured out a way of creating a geometry of panels which, as the sun heated up during the day, they were able to create movement. Now, none of this didn't require any moving parts. All it required was a new material. Now, that's sitting in the bottom drawer of this research lab because it wasn't aligned to what their research focus was, and they don't know what to do with it. And it's been sitting there now for about 4 or 5 years. So that's an example of, I guess, coming into these spaces and not having to work within this confine of intent. You know, we are going to do this, and you artists, all your job is to help us achieve this product. I read something in the paper half an hour before I got here, and it totally fascinated me. It was breast self-examination. Okay, so all the ladies in the audience are familiar with this horrible machine that you go and get your boobie squashed, and the machine is about trying to find any precancerous tissue, nodules and nodes and so forth. So you would think if innovation was applied to that space, what they'd be trying to do is to create a finer grained capacity in the technology. But what they did was they realised that vision impaired and blind women have developed increased nerve endings in their fingertips. And in fact, what they're doing is they are identifying precancerous nodes 30% more often than the machines, and when they're 50% smaller. Now, I think when you've got that intent and you're kind of on that railroad of products and marketplaces and so forth, that just would never have entered the equation. So first thing I want to do is kind of unshackle that idea of intent, because all it does is artists get hitched to some wagon and they can only ever think about where that wagon is going. So I think artist-led innovation is absolutely crucial, and I think it needs to be unshackled from intent. It doesn't mean they're not going to deliver stuff, because they always do. But if you know at the outset where your thinking is going, then you're shutting down a huge amount of potential, I'm going to say that word, innovation. So that was really the first thing I wanted to say. And you know, in a recent article, QUT Vice-Chancellor Margaret Shield notes that the growing trend towards treating research as a purely transactional investment, blind to the benefits that accrue outside of the ledger, is a problem. And that's the way, in Australia, that's the way the powers that be and the people who've got the money, it's transactional. It's only ever transactional. And so it's only really if you can break out. So, for example, and you know, when all that innovation money came along, we thought, excellent, there's going to be all this money for artists and be able to experiment and play in this space. But in fact, it was such a rigid space that it didn't achieve any of the things that we were trying to achieve. So what we do, you know, there's this great quote. It's one of my favourite quotes. If we knew what it was we were doing, it wouldn't be called research. And that was Albert Einstein. And so we do that a lot. That's the way we focus our bringing artists together with scientists and technologists. Is this? It's very speculative. We say, if you know at the outset what you're going to do, just go and do it. You don't need to do this research. What the research, these research partnerships about, is bringing different types of knowledge systems to bear on you've got to kind of focus a little bit. So, for example, you know, we had a sound artist who found out that people with cochlear implants have a really difficult time with music appreciation, because what cochlear implants do is they dampen down the high and low frequencies, and they boost a very narrow range of frequencies, which are optimised for voice. So if you're listening to your favourite song, it sounds really bad. And so that was kind of the question of what they were going to go and investigate together. And what ended up happening was the sound artist inveigled, you know, half a dozen composer friends of his. They created compositions for that very narrow frequency range. They had 2 performances of those at the Arts Centre in Melbourne. Now, packed out. And then as you went in, you got a piece of paper and you had to say what your hearing profile was, whether you're a cochlear implant wearer, whether you wore hearing aids, whether you had good hearing. And then the lights would come up at the end of every bit and you'd say, well, that sounded pretty ordinary, or I really loved that, or whatever. And then the University of Western Sydney then had a whole research overlay about that, which fed back into the Bionic Ear Institute's research. So often these have got a long tail, these types of experimentations. You know, it might not be that they figured something out immediately, but it's what happens and how people work with that research afterwards. So I guess I want to say that I have a real problem bringing artists into this space when there's such a strong intent towards the market, because I think what it does is it actually closes down and shuts down thinking, and it shuts down innovation. So that's my provocation. Yeah.
Sarah, would you like to add anything to that?
No, that was really good. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in furious agreement. Like, I think that the point Vicky's making is that like artistic exploration can be like a generative methodology. That sounds so university, but like the process of making art and investigating data and materials and situations and sites and information can produce knowledge that is far beyond the original expectations of the experiment that it is put into. And we know this because if you set up a scientific experiment design, you are testing for very, very certain factors, and you will get confirmation or non-confirmation of those factors. And failure is fine, because then you go to the next thing and you test again A, B, whatever. But there are better methodologies for experimentation that involve creative disciplines, where you might find something or you might not, or you might open up new avenues for exploration that are not necessarily so product focused, as Vicky said. Like, okay, we're going to design, what we're going to do is we're going to improve the efficiency of this manufacturing method one. Okay, fine. You could test for that, but if you bring in an arts focus, an embodied focus, a human focus, you could actually end up improving workflows for business practices, for human resources, for the design of value-added materials. You could find new materials, all these sorts of things that are not within the really narrow parameters of a scientific investigation. And oh man, I had a killer point that's just like totally left my mind. Arts and investigation.
I can jump in.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, definitely the designing for market is really problematic from also an accessibility perspective. I've found through, previous work and experience that often if you are looking at that framework, when it comes to the panels that decide what ideas to go forward to market, they often are not a diverse panel. And the people who decide what gets funded or what gets put as a product in the world or a process in the world, that's a place where I think accessibility conversations need to be if that framework exists, because that's a really good space for change if we are using that framework. I do agree with Vicky, though, that it's not an ideal framework, but within the framework itself, I'm finding the lack of diversity within the decision-making.
I did remember my killer point.
Good, right?
It was totally unrelated. It's a total terrible non sequitur from what Sarah just said. But just referring to something Adrian said at the beginning, that this idea of a brain drain, right? Yeah, there is a brain drain in the fourth industrial revolution, which is tech and this automated intelligence and life and stuff. We are putting all of our resources into teaching kids how to do science and technology and engineering and maths in order to produce advanced algorithms to sell people shit they don't need, right? And to swing elections and to do absolutely nonsensical, non-productive, rent-seeking bullshit. Like, if you think about like these apps that we're so conditioned to using, you know, the Instagrams, the Facebooks, and the Twitters and whatnot, they have, no kidding, the most advanced engineering that humanity has ever produced. Why are we dedicating all this cultural productivity to this nonsense? So what we do at my lab is we look at those paradigms that do exist that can be potentially useful. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, machine-led tracking of human embodied behavior in space, and we think about how we can use these tools in order to benefit society's understanding of itself. So you can, instead of using artificial intelligence algorithms to game the US democratic system, you can use it to investigate, to share culture across across borders that would otherwise never be breached. And there was this really great example of a total failure of tech from a couple of years ago, so-called failure, where Google, I'm sure people in this room have done this, that Google had this app where you could upload a photo of yourself and the Google Cultural Institute would return you a famous painting that looked like you. Who did that? You did that, definitely, yes. Absolutely. Not definitely yes, just because you raised your hand. There was this massive blowback because what happened was that like people of color were putting in their photos and getting back either white people or these highly racialized depictions. And everyone was like, this is a total failure of artificial intelligence. This is a total failure of technology, when actually it was an amazing success of technology in that, to quote Monty Python, it showed the violence inherent in the system. Like, it showed how racially based our cultural prejudices are in terms of representation, collecting, rich people giving money to, in big international museums and what they buy, all these sorts of stuff. So, to bring my rant to a conclusion, like, we do have a brain drain, not in the sense that all these people are going overseas, but we're diverting the potential of us as a smart nation with all the ability to do good stuff towards absolute inanity. Yeah. I sound like I'm 80, don't I? I have Instagram, but I'm just saying, we have the potential as Australia to be this incredibly smart nation that leads design of human experience. Full stop. Exclamation mark.
Hashtag.
Hashtag.
Yeah. I'm curious to hear what the audience has to say. Yeah.
If I may, I'll jump in. David Clarkson.
Please.
Thank you.
Introduce
Here I am.
yourself as well.
Okay, sure. David Clarkson. My particular interest, a couple of years ago I was awarded the Art and Technology Fellowship from Create New South Wales, so I'm kind of very much in this space. Just a couple of points. One is about the market and the brain drain for artists who are successful. And it's in regards to my career, I spend most of my time overseas. Even the things I do have that are ready to go to market are hard to sell in Australia. So on a very just commercial, artistic level, Australia is so small-minded, possibly, not to knock Australia too badly, but so I think there is a big challenge there. And so I just wanted to put that as a seed. And also a little bit devil's advocate about all the, great maths behind Facebook. So I spoke at a symposium recently to do with the Breakthrough Initiative. And if some of you know, that's partly run by Yuri Milner and Steven Zuckerberg. So they're putting huge amounts of money and they're using their search engines for really interesting, I think, creative research to look for extraterrestrial planets, to look for exoplanets. That is actually feeding creatively, it feeds me. So it's not all bad news, it's about how you creatively use that maths.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. But in particular, I just wanted to, ask about how, as artists, can we, be more recognised in an innovative market sense? Because even that seems problematic. with the small scale of the Australian population?
Look, I totally agree. There's a wonderful artist called George Coote here in New South Wales, and George was working at the Children's Hospital at Westmead, and he was approached by the head paediatrician there, and she was having to put kids through recurrent painful procedures. So, once you've had chemo once as a kid, you don't want to go the second time, but you've got to keep going. And their gold standard at that time was just distraction. They'd play a movie. So she was really interested in working with George. George's practice is around using biofeedback as part of his work. And so what he developed up was an app that actually rewarded the children. So they had a little heart rate monitor on their finger, and as they were able to slow their heart rate down, they were rewarded with more exciting stuff on the screen and audibly. And it worked very well, and it's been trialled and going through clinical trials both here and in the UK. And so he set up a company to sell this system. And we tried to assist him in terms of brokering access to start-up money and venture capitalists and so forth. And we couldn't get them to understand the value of the product, even with all of the research, which was showing that this was an incredibly effective thing. And in fact, the odd thing was that the market almost itself decided where the value was, which was, okay, well, this would be great for home meditation practice, or physiotherapists for some reason decided it was a great thing, but it floundered. It was really, really difficult to get that investment. So I agree with you. I think even when you do come up with something, or artists come up with something, it can be very difficult to access those kind of investment, that investment infrastructure. So I agree totally.
I think as an artist, a fellow artist, I'm not sure where we're getting our business practice knowledge from. We're taught how to self-produce, and we're taught how to write funding applications. And for me as a circus performer, I'm taught, okay, I need to do some corporate entertainment and, that kind of thing. But I'm really interested in getting a business partner and in getting that business savvy knowledge so that I can either run it myself or know how to play this fierce game. So I suspect there's maybe a knowledge gap within our sector. And also, I'm also reminded that, of finding the space where your product might be picked up, what Vicky was just saying, what the other markets might be that we haven't thought about yet. I know in the accessibility world, if you're someone who uses a wheelchair, you often have to say, well, my access needs are good for people with prams and people with bags of luggage on wheels as well. So it's finding those other conversations, but that's all I can think of to contribute.
I mean, I think a path to recognition is by demonstrating the value of an artistic method of interrogating all these tools and data and all that kind of stuff. Like you were saying, those tools are very powerful. Let's use them to reveal, like what art has always revealed, truths about humanity and existence and all that kind of stuff. Because in Australia, unfortunately, the arts there's a cultural gap of relevance and a misunderstanding of the place of artistic investigation in our lives and the value of it, which is why we continually have to have this STEM debate. Like, why is it that, as humanities people, we have to keep trying to shove an A in? Imagine if the acronym didn't, you couldn't put an A in there. What would you do? But the art market, I don't know, the art market for new media art is also a weird thing. It's weird. I wouldn't necessarily judge the difficulty in selling things commercially as a sign of the value of that kind of practice. And I just think that we need to keep pushing at those applications of these tools, because, as I've been saying, it's through artistic application that the value of the tools gets revealed. I couldn't care less if I can AI engineer a dog's nose on my face, but you could use that algorithm to show something truly remarkable about, culture. And by by us continually demonstrating those applications, that's how we break through that kind of knowledge gap, I would say.
And I think too, sorry, I'll just, one more thing, we had this artist who went and worked with Nanotechnology Victoria, and their whole shtick was transdermal drug delivery. And, but of course, and they were focusing on insulin. But the method of application these scientists had come up with was about as ordinary as the old process, right? And so what she did was she went and created a series of jewellery that would hold the transdermal patch, ears, on your rings and so forth. And they registered had a number of design registrations. But then, of course, the Victorian state government decided they weren't going to fund Nanotechnology Victoria anymore. It got closed down. And so those design registrations are just kind of sitting there. And so, maybe part of the solution is some kind of peak body which is able to act as a kind of conduit from the artistic, creative side of things into the venture capital side of things. I'm not sure. I don't know how, there's so many different pressures on that system.
No, but it is, I've been talking to venture capitalists as well, and that does seem to be the gap. And it's, as an artist, you can't be everything. You can try, but you can do a lot of things. But yeah,
and you can't, George, it kind of wasn't George's job to take it the next step. He'd done all the work, but there was nothing there to facilitate that for him.
Hi, I'm Bethwyn from AMPAG. I think this is a really interesting conversation, but I sometimes think we think arts has the problem, and I'm wondering if the problem's a little bit broader than that. I think it's a COLA, the academics looked at how little innovation was actually going to market. I know that's a dreadful concept to be narrowed, but for all of science and all sorts of things happening at universities in Australia, and so many of our research discoveries ending up being picked up and identified by overseas, Germany, UK, the US. So I'm wondering if we're sort of the tail of a bigger dog. And I was on the assessment panel at the ARC on humanities and social sciences for engagement and impact. And it was really amazing because I got to see 220 universities of what they're doing in this space. And I thought, we live in the arts all the time, and I hadn't heard of a tenth of this. And so it's really interesting hearing your work tonight. There seems to be a really big gap in the sort of believers in the community of innovation in the arts. We talk about it a lot at AMPAG, but it's not necessarily what our members are doing day to day. And so that's another observation. And then finally, there's a concept that's going around that the Greens have put it in their election platform, which they released last week but didn't tell anyone, which is about a creativity commission. And then Russell Howcroft's talking about a creativity commission. And it was very interesting. I met with Russell, and he was really concerned that the arts didn't overtake that concept, that suddenly it would put us back into a traditional understanding of the arts as creative, that he wanted it to be more ubiquitous across all parts of society. So I thought it'd be interesting to know what the panel thought of that. So sort of 3 ideas there.
Okay, on the idea of the arts having a visibility problem for innovation and sorry, what's the key metric for impact? Impact, right? So I think there are cultural problems. Because obviously I work in fine arts, visual arts, and there are cultural barriers towards the acceptance and kind of like production of research in this area because of this idea that especially digital things are not real. They're unreal. They're copies. They're not a proper visual language. They're not an art form. Blah 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 blah. So where there are opportunities for artists to contribute to technological innovation or to use these kinds of non-material forms, like they kind of looked at suspiciously, which I think is a total failure of the industry and not of the practitioners, because Australia actually has an amazing infrastructure for innovative experimental arts practice. And if you think about people like Stellark, like sewing ears, growing ears off their arms and like turning themselves into robots, and yet the gallery sector is ultra conservative because it has a very 19th century model of what curatorial practice is, of what art is, of what research and experimentation and knowledge is in the cultural sector, which is super ironic. So there needs to be some sort of cultural change, and how you make that change, I'm not sure, because the arts as an industry doesn't have a lot of churn, there's not a lot of jobs, there's not a lot of revitalisation, there's not a lot of promotion, there's not a lot of opportunity for young people who grow up with all these ideas as like core ideas of their existence, to get into the industry and promote them. But having said that, Australia is doing the most incredible experimental artistic practice. We don't hear about it because it's not because it's not being done, and it's not because the talent isn't here. The talent is world leading in Australia. It's because of sort of like, I guess, like deep-rooted ideas about what art is, what innovation is, what culture is, what is appropriate for practitioners to be pursuing in our time. Does that provide some answer?
Same to me, we suffer from being all quite isolated.
Totally.
Are you using the microphone?
Yeah, sorry. Listening to what you're saying, one, in the art space, we're quite isolated from each other when it's very hard for us all to keep that communication across the sector. There's different parts of the sector, but...
Yeah, but I remember, Beth, when I remember hearing, Opera Australia saying they were leading the world and leading Australia with this use of digital technology, and it was like, you've got to be kidding. There were companies that have been doing that 5-10 years before. But, and I just literally fell off my seat when that was happening, so I think you're right. There is a bit of a... We're not all working together towards the same...
It's sort of like that critical mass. I know why they said that. It's very good marketing, and for them they were saving a lot of money. But there's like this, not that critical mass where we gather, and that role that comes and the momentum that comes. It seems like there's a lot of stop and starting. But I actually was talking about, in Australia, beyond what happens in arts research, it's actually research. There's something culturally about us backing our innovation generally, and that's what I meant by the tail wagging the dog. But it's not just arts that have this problem, it's a bigger systemic problem.
We're suspicious of knowledge in Australia. We're not comfortable with it. Certainly, when I say we, we've been, and far be it for me to make any comments about political parties at this point in time in our country's life, but, there is a very, I do think that our current government is kind of afraid of ideas and afraid of innovation, actually, except for that very, very narrow idea that they've got, and so they're pouring money in there. But with the ARC and the NH, they've been just stripping money out of research, and so in that sense there is a brain drain, because a lot of the more advanced, you talk about Stellark and Sarah Kenderdine, who's been working, did a lot of work with where Andrew's been working. She has had to go overseas to actually get the kind of investment she needs to do the work she's doing. And this woman is one of the absolute world experts in, what she's doing with very large resolution audio-visual material is making cultural sites available to people who otherwise would never get to see them. But it's just not valued here. And so there's no investment, and these people go offshore and they get funded to set up these, wonderful labs overseas.
Just one other thing. The other thing that was said to me is that when you're saying about this government not being interested or believing in it, I think there's also such a scarcity of funding in this space that there's also the traditional science researchers that were petrified of their funding being diluted. And so it's that sort of scarcity of resources leads to a scarcity of collaboration, and it spirals. And so how do you, and I don't know this space that well, but if you've got true believers in science and technology in universities, how do they advocate for this broader approach? Because there's plenty of scientists and engineers that don't want to diffuse their funding pot for another lot to sit around the table.
And all of their funding is for applied research. So that's the problem. You know, they're locked into these kind of, this is what we've been given the money for, and they've already pretty much done the work, and so they apply for the money retrospectively and they get the money so they can take it a bit further. There is no funding for speculative or pure research in Australia anymore, and that's part of the problem.
We had another question just at the front.
Yeah, and it's some of it
just
is.
introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. My name's Esty Darren Cooper. I'm from Creative Partnerships Australia. Part of my question has perhaps already been covered in that wonderful discussion that ensued from that question, but I guess I've heard a bit from all of you about some of the roadblocks that exist in recognising the value of artists or the arts sector to be able to contribute to the progress of ideas or, and in inverted commas, innovation. Some of those were the fact that public funding is often tied to quite particular outcomes, which is difficult. The fact that perhaps the arts sector exists within a bubble that doesn't then have a seat at tables where discussions with scientists, for example, are taking place. And then you spoke a little bit about the arts sector perhaps not working in unison, so the fragmentation within the sector and perhaps also business skills from, or artists not having the relevant business skills. I wondered whether you could point to any jurisdictions that are doing, that have overcome those barriers, or that where you think the arts is playing the role that we want to have it in Australia, and could talk a little bit about what infrastructure they have in place, perhaps how they got to where they are, and then thirdly, ways that we could adapt that so that it's relevant in the cultural context of Australia. There's a lot in that, so tackle one part of it, which was, can you point to any jurisdictions that you think have overcome some of the barriers that might exist in Australia?
2 letters, EU.
While it still exists, yeah.
Pretty much.
Could you talk a bit more about that?
Well, a lot of the money in the arts science space is coming through the European Union. They do seem to have a bit of an understanding of the ecosystem. So there are a lot of labs in the EU doing the type of work that, for example, Annette does with speculative research and not pure research. But even then, I mean, every jurisdiction is under pressure. I wanted to come back, if someone could pick up, I wanted to come back on something you said a bit earlier. I was just thinking about
Yeah. The thing that's coming to my mind, and I'm not as expert in the frameworks and the scene as my wonderful other panellists are, but I'm just wondering how we're going with cross-cultural communication. Like, I've come from a landscape of campaigning. What do you do to change the things around you to make life better? And so one of those things, and what do you do when you're talking to another group who doesn't speak your language or doesn't know where you're coming from in terms of your value set or what your outcomes need to be? So I'm wondering, even in hearing these questions, it's like, well, there's so much in this question. We're so expressive. We're really expressive artists are. So how do we learn their language and how do they learn ours? Because anytime we want to connect with this thing over there, that's one place to start. That's what's coming into my mind at the moment.
I think it's an impossible question to answer right now. It's that's like it's the fundamental question. That's the fundamental question that's facing all universities and research institutes and like tertiary education and I think that obviously this is one thing that puzzles me, right? That tertiary education is the third most valuable export industry for Australia after coal and iron ore. And yet it receives an absolute pounding in popular culture when it comes to questions of whether we should invest in it and whether we should commit to it and what the value of a degree is. You know, people, even from inside universities, where there's push to like constantly up your ranking, and you know, what are the product outcomes? You know, all the stuff we've been talking about. What is the commercial outcome of this sort of thing, which has a particular effect on what education is? You know, and yet it is this sector that totally outpaces all of like almost everything in Australian culture. But, like, yes, it does need more resourcing. Yes, we do need more institutions that advocate for research and for artists and practitioners and all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, we know that it's not going to happen, right? So we need to put in place educational strategies that shift our focus from the grassroots towards this idea of education and research and projects being natively collaborative and cross-disciplinary, and training our humanities practitioners with a broad skill set that allows them to be able to think outside the box and to think that it is totally normal and the way of the future for an artist or a dancer or a poet or whatever to collaborate with a scientist. And we know that these things bring amazing results.
And I think there's space in the universities for that. There is space for engagement. Like working at UTS for a year and being an artist, I can see that there's opportunity there. And sometimes it might seem like a brick wall, but maybe there's spaces and places to nurture that. So, for example, many of us in the room work for organisations. So what can we do to create those cross-cultural collaborations that Andrew's just mentioning? You know, when I was part of Scent of Sydney for Sydney Festival, and artist Kat Jones was working in a lab at UTS, how can we foster more of those things and also the collaborations that Anat does? You know, there is those small steps that we can take to create those bigger changes.
Part of the problem is that scientists are only allowed to apply themselves to projects that have research dollars coming in, basically. You know, it's very, very difficult to get. So we often have to get very high-level buy-in at an institution. Most of our partners are university-based or government-based. Part of it's about the metrics that we use to measure value in the arts. Most of our metrics are around audience. Mm-hmm. So, for example, those arts organisations that are involving themselves at the creative research and development end of the artistic life cycle can find it very difficult to talk about value. For example, we get, with our Synapse Art Science Residency program, we get a return of between $4 and $5 for every dollar from our industry partners from the government money we get. It's very difficult to tell that story when all of our artistic metrics are around audience numbers. So it's also about how we measure impact in the arts. I think there are increasingly places where these types of discussions can happen. We've just got the Science Gallery coming in University of Melbourne. We had Spectra last year, which was the first art science biennial, and it brought all these artists and scientists together, and they all kind of spent the first 2 days going, oh my God, look at you all, look at all these people. I thought I was the only one. You know, so it is about part of it's about the structure of how, you know, for example, so you're from, you know, I like to joke about how you guys have the same acronym as the Chartered Practicing Accountants of Australia. But, you know, and I think that's part of it. You know, I've been to a number of the kind of how to make money, you know, from the private sector and the philanthropic sector. And it's all about donor schemes and this and that. You know, it's very hard for us to kind of get a wedge in there and go, well, hang on, we're getting 400% return on investment for every single residency we do, but it's not seen as a valuable measure. So part of it's infrastructure as well.
Vicky, Adrian from SAMAG. With that EU model, do they have examples of the way that they measure impact that would work for us here?
Yeah, look, the entire arts industry is, of course, challenged by the whole concept of qualitative measurement. I think, so we use, for example, we've been using a survey for our art science residencies that was developed by Artisan Labs in Switzerland. It was University of Zurich. They got some sociologists to create a kind of a way of capturing value of these things. So I think actually it comes down to storytelling, and the thing that's kind of ironic is surely we, the arts industry, should be the best people at telling, you know, we should figure out how to tell stories, right? And we're really fairly crap at it. So I think this idea of capturing the long tail, because, you know, for example, Erica Seacon went and worked at Department of Applied Mathematics at ANU in 2010, and she just never left. You know, last year she won the Waterhouse Prize with the work that she developed there. There are these very long tails, and they're not captured in 12-month acquittal cycles. So part of our challenge has been how do we communicate and talk about that? And I think telling stories is one of the best ways. And if anyone should be able to do that, we should, right? But we're really bad at it. So.
And Peter, I'm wondering if you've got any examples, because you've been moderating, you haven't had much of an opportunity to say too much. Have you got any examples or anything from the world that you're working in with?
Sure, yeah, no, thank you. Look, I think I've had such a varied career today, and I think starting off in the arts and then going through a financial crisis at the other side of the world in Italy during the GFC, and then having to basically self-fund. I'm self-made, so I had to figure out how I was going to fund myself while I was there living as a struggling artist in Florence, Italy. And I started to realise that the creative industries needed a new business model. It needed a business model that was relevant, sustainable, and didn't. It's not about instant return. It's about how do you grow sustainably? How do you develop something that, I guess it's different. It required a different methodology. And that's sort of what inspired me, I guess, to go back and study business, but from the perspective of an artist and as a designer. So then it inspired me to create my own business, and I looked at intersections and looking at how I guess we could see better collaboration between the arts and the business world and the sciences, and I ultimately created my own role here at the CSIRO. So I think it's very much about storytelling. I agree with your point. I think it's also being able to tell your own story and understand what your unique value is, and what you bring, and what the impact it is that you can create through your perspective in art practice. It's definitely a storytelling and learning piece, and I think unique experiences in life can help inform and sort of help you to create those journeys and tell that story.
And I think the longer the length of the tail, the more difficult it is. You know, I often tell this story where, you know, Patricia Piccinini was a digital photographer. Then she came and did 2 NAT summer schools in late 80s, early 90s in CAD, computer-aided design. And suddenly she moved her practice into these kind of objects and things like that. Now, NAT can't go around saying, well, we're responsible for Patricia's wonderful success. But we played a part in it. So it's different. How do you measure that? You know, when we did ISEA here, which was the International Symposium on Electronic Art in 2013, we ran the third ISEA in 1992, and we at that event we showed we had the first projection mapping showing in Australia. And when we had the opening event for ISEA 2013, we held it on the MCA rooftop on the last night of Vivid. And it was like, look, this many years later, look at what's happening now with this kind of projection mapping. But again, you can't kind of sit there and go, well, that was ANAT, It's because there are so many different influences there. But at the same time, we were integral. We did play a role. So it's a very difficult, and I think it does come down to how we structure the industry and how we tell the stories.
Yes, another question. There's the roaming mic.
Hi, my name's Carmel Schenker. I'm from In Play Arts. It's a company that I have with my partner Tony Weir, who's an actor and a business consultant, and I'm traditionally a performing arts producer. I've worked across not-for-profit, major performing arts, government, and so what we do at In Play Arts is we have worked with theatre-based programs we've created to build capability in organisations for what we call working live, for actually bringing technical skills into a live collaborative space so that people can work across functions and actually work effectively to innovate and deliver on strategy. I'm really interested in a lot of this conversation. One part is the idea of going to market. We've done this all off our own bat, and actually getting to market is the really hard bit. We've had some great benefit from things like the R&D tax incentive that kind of gave us a windfall that managed to give us a longer life in making the programs. Where we struggle is kind of getting it to market. Neither of us are salespeople, particularly interested in being salespeople to corporates. We're getting there and it sustains us, but that's a challenge. And something that I so often think about, having come from being a performing arts producer into a business world that I kind of had to trust and did a lot of research of my own and realised how people are clamouring for creative skills, and I read ridiculous conversations about, is it coffee or is it lack of sleep, or is it alcohol, and all these things that can make you creative, and and it just led me over a few years to think there's just this abundance of asset that the performing arts and the broader arts community have. And I just want to pick up on the discussion of a peak body. I think there is a gap. It's all the discussions that have been had here about, that we're disconnected. I really see that the benefit, the creativity is sitting in the artists that are scattered from individual artists to artists in small to medium sector, in the artists in the major performing arts. And I think there's really room, and I really often think about Creative Partnerships Australia as maybe a body to help spur this beyond donors. Actually, we don't want donations. I mean, we do want donations. but we have something to sell here, and how do we do it? And how do we lobby governments that are cutting back arts funding right at the same time? Did anyone see that Q&A? Everyone saw that Q&A where Katie Noonan took on Malcolm Turnbull, kind of, you've just cut the arts funding, yet you need creative skills. And I really think it's a really interesting conversation around a peak body who can actually help the small to medium sectors with people like consultants to help them translate their skills into what business needs, or whether it's science or technology. That's not my area at all. We're more in kind of corporations and organisational development, but still help them translate those skills and then help them to make the connections actually with those people who need those skills. And I think I often wonder whether Creative Partnerships Australia is something that could be extended there, or whether it's a different peak body that's needed. But I think that's a discussion that I'm really interested in being developed. It's just a comment, I suppose, or a question if anyone's got something to add to that discussion.
Yeah, it's almost like we need an art bank for
How do we move this
creative
forward?
systems thinking rather than just artworks, right?
I also think the small steps can lead to big change. From little things, big things grow. How many of us have been to our local MP to talk about this issue? How many... I want to be pragmatic. We talk about... I do agree absolutely with the structural stuff, and I absolutely think that, the peak body and really supportive of everything that's being said. And I sit in a lot of conversations where we go, oh, okay, how come barriers? And having lived a life where I have to challenge barriers every day, I couldn't even vote in the New South Wales elections because it wasn't accessible. So I had to rig up and go, okay, I'd like this to be changed. What's going to happen for the election? Can I vote in the next couple of weeks for the federal? So I have to live my life always having to report back and educate around. And so if we are talking about things that impact on our livelihood and the things that we want to see idealistically in the world, what is that small thing that we can do?
Can I, since I've got the microphone, say something else? I meant to say at the beginning that I just feel like this is such a big subject about the future of our sector as a broad sector. I think it's more than one SAMAG. Can we have more? Can we
come to the next one then as well?
Can we do a think tank? Around setting up. What do we do? How do we lobby?
Can I?
Can you say it
Could
with
you?
a microphone?
Yeah, microphone, please.
Oh, I just want to say the
No,
election.
it's very important for us to have the microphone, please.
Sure. The election hasn't happened and it's not too late to write letters. And there's only so much peak bodies can do. Not that anyone wants to be lazy. And I work a lot with a joint of peak bodies now in the performing arts. They need to come from the individuals at this point. Peak bodies go in later, but they need individual stories right now. And this week in particular, before Friday, I would just suggest. And the other thing I was going to say that I work with, it's a really dry piece of advisory work we do with the Education Department about designing the vet courses. And there's a whole lot of vet courses nobody does, and we start wondering why does anyone do the vet courses, and then we're so educated at university. But the conundrum we're looking at has been how do we create some vet courses that enable artists to work across other industries. And they're struggling to work out what that looks like because they can't do the course until they can prove demand. So they're starting with health and mainly health. But I think it's an area that there is other work, again, for the joining up.
I'm not talking about an existing peak body. I'm talking about a new peak body. A body that their job is, for example, to channel brilliant artistic ideas that could have traction in industry with investment. Now, none of our peak bodies does that. It would require a new entity. So I wasn't casting dispersions on...
Sorry, I wasn't taking it like that at all. Can I just... Where's that microphone? This will be brief, but just in an example in regards to Australia and, say, China. So last year I was accepted to do a business and investment pitch at the Shanghai Performing Arts Market. And I was pitching 3D interactive technology and tracking as a kind of media event. I ended up talking to a venture capitalist from Hong Kong, and we were discussing a $500 million deal. Huge money, mind-boggling. It felt, 6 months of negotiation. I was in an NDA, couldn't talk about it. It fell through. So that level of, and this is just me, I'm sure there's other people, there's that level of creativity happening out of Australia, and yet it's almost impossible to have those conversations in Australia. I go to China, I go to Korea, even, excuse me, I am an ex-Kiwi, but even I'm having those conversations in New Zealand, but it's very hard to get taken seriously as an artist in this country.
Yeah, well, the first thing we need to do is add a couple of O's onto the end of anything we do, because they don't take us seriously otherwise.
Yeah.
I think a peak body, okay, in theory, great idea. But advocacy for government funds is not a sustainable model for the development of the arts community. Oh, no, I know. Yeah, totally. I'm just about to punch through to the next rhetorical stage which is to say that the peak body's got to advocate for a new model of arts development that is entrepreneurial. Because every time someone's picked up the mic tonight, it was like, okay, we've got these ideas, we need support to generate self-funding and sustainable models. Like nobody's like, everyone realizes that model of like, hold out your hat so I can make my, really esoteric artwork about, frogs. It's over. But everybody has been saying, how do we support a form of, innovative entrepreneurship in the arts? And so that's what a peak body needs to do. A peak body that continues to fight for arts funding will fail. It will fail. Absolutely. Absolutely. So it needs to be into education policy. It needs to be in like wider cultural policy. I don't know if there is an arts policy in Australia.
About to be, I think, maybe.
Yeah, I know. Like literally, and so it's a holistic thing. So an advocate for holistic systemic change. Great. An advocate for us to get more money. We're stuffed.
Yeah, I'm actually an artist, and I feel very fortunate actually because I can get into the zone and just sort of, channel sort of, that innate creativity which I think we all have as human beings. And so I feel very, very grateful. But I came along to this, and it is very hard to, it seems very removed from actually the art process. It does seem like everyone's concentrating on their own little bubble and their own little unit. And it's interesting to say that there's a brain drain because the next wave of technology will be about the brain and mind sciences and nanotechnology and all of that. And we're sort of on the cusp of that. And I don't think anyone's looking at the bigger picture, how it's going to absolutely reframe everything we currently can comprehend at the moment. And it is sort of quite exciting, but it's also quite spooky. And it's not 10 years away, it's not 100 years away, it's coming through now. So I think these are the issues that have got to be addressed, and I think there's why there's such trouble with things going around in circles, because it's hard to have a narrative when you don't even know the trajectory. We don't really know where we're going on so many levels. And we've also got the sleeping giants that are starting to wake up, like if you go out to places like Broken Hill or Upper Hunter Valley, you'll start to see the ramifications happening now with climate change and things like that. So, yeah, we're living in quite interesting times, and it's I don't have any answers, but I do hope if things go the right way, we could create a fantastic world. So, yeah.
I think if we leave it up to the STEM disciplines, it might be a little less fantastic than it could be if we involved artists.
I'm another part of in-play arts. Most of my life is actually on the other side of the ledger.
Could you just introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Tony Weir,
Tony,
and
great.
I'm part of in-play arts as well. I was provoked, I guess, by Vicky when you said this sense of decoupling, like the need to decouple artistic practice from intent within partnership projects, for instance. It challenged me because for most of my professional work, I'm working with executives, with the CEO who is struggling to name their intent in a broad enough way to enable innovative, new, novel things to happen. So it's not as if, like a lot of the conversation feels like it's us artists against or in contradiction to this world of accounting processes and bottom lines and so on. When you're actually engaged with the human beings who are in that world, they are struggling with these same things themselves to say, must I be bound to a simple, a single bottom line? How do I name what our organisation wants to be in a broader way? And what I do as a theatre practitioner is to bring theatre practices to help extend their imagination to those sorts of things so that they can change, so that they can embrace some of those new things. So I guess if there's a question, it's to say, how do we as artists not get a seat at the table, but become a part of the conversation, those conversations, as well as our specific artistic practices within their projects?
In our experience, the private sector has been very much more open to risk taking and working with artists, much more than government. We had a great project with Lend-Lease, and they were just well on board. It was a long project. It was a 10-year project. It was very innovative. It was very experimental. And they stumped up the money. There were partnerships. There were probably 15 different partners in the project. They were the lead partner with us. And the project got scuttled because of the risk aversion of a city council. So in fact, in our experience, we find that the private sector is much more open to this type of practice than government and kind of, well, even the university sector. I mean, have you ever dealt with the university legal departments? They are the most risk-averse entities in the world. So, you know, it's kind of interesting. We actually find that the private sector is very open.
Yeah, and those stories might be what's sort of like the germs of really useful stories to extend those conversations to the more recalcitrant bodies of knowledge or bodies of power.
And so knowing, like what I'm hearing also is the clarity of purpose, a little bit when the person was talking about the theatre company they were working with. You know, as an artist, it's something I learned in New Zealand when I was practising and cutting my teeth over there, was always know what's in your artist backpack, always know what's in your history and what ground you walk on and carry that forward with you. And so when we're wanting to join this arts sector with the STEM sector or the ideas of innovation or business practice, what has gone before us in our own arts practice that has been successful, or what is the example we look at that we can also tell that story when we're talking to prospective people we want to engage with. Like, for example, I know in the disability community that we say, hey, text messaging was invented because of someone who was deaf. You know, so I know some of my innovation stories that I put forward in my community when I want to change things in that sort of creative innovation kind of space. And so I'd just ask, do you know yours?
So unfortunately we've run out of time, but before you all leave, I'd like to, it's a good segue into this quote I'd love to share with you. Basically it's by Walter Isaacson, and he wrote this in the World Economic Forum. And the article is entitled, Why Innovation Needs Both Art and Science. And I'll take this quote. So, innovation will come from people who are able to link beauty to engineering, humanity to technology, and poetry to processes. In other words, it will come from the spiritual hairs of Ada Lovelace, creators who can flourish where the arts intersect with the sciences, and who have a rebellious sense of wonder that opens them up to the beauty of both. So I thought that was a nice way to end this evening, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone. That was a fantastic discussion. We invite you to join us outside for a drink and a chat, and if you want to continue the conversation, you're welcome to do that. Thank you very much to all of you. You've been terrific. We also invite you, if you have ideas about future SAMAG events, things that you might want us to follow up on, if you have any of those kind of ideas, please get in touch. You can speak to me afterwards, and we're very happy to facilitate that and try and put that into our thinking around our programming. So thank you for coming, and come and have a chat afterwards.